White 8800 owners all said the same thing. Not one system they liked, not one component, almost the entire machine. The late 1970s. The American grain belt is expanding fast. Farms are getting larger, harvest windows are getting shorter, and mid-size combines are moving off dealer lots before they're even fully assembled. Two manufacturers showed up that season with what they called answers. White Farm Equipment brought the 8800, a conventional thresher built around a hydrostatic ground drive. Up in Canada, Versatile arrived with something structurally different, the Transaxial 2000, their first in-house twin-rotor self-propelled combine. Both were sold as steps forward. Both fell apart, but for completely different reasons. The 8800 had one critical weakness built into its foundation. The hydrostatic drive held up fine until sustained load arrived, and when it did, the system overheated. And when it overheated, it quit, not randomly, predictably. The fix required specific calibration knowledge that wasn't in the manual, not even close to it. One farm ran two 8800s side by side. Both failed under the same field conditions. That's not a mechanical anomaly. That's a design decision that didn't survive contact with a real harvest. Fuel consumption made the picture worse. Operators compared the 8800 against competitors in the same weight class, and the ratio simply didn't hold up. More fuel burned per bushel harvested, less confidence in the drive at peak load, and a grain platform, the quick-cut header, that demanded precise adjustments most operators never found in the documentation. Get those settings wrong, and the bunkered sample looked less like clean grain and more like a bad decision. Then September 4th, 1980, White Motor Corporation filed for bankruptcy. The 8800 became an orphan machine almost immediately. No parts pipeline, a dealer network that was actively dissolving. Every subsequent failure in the field stopped being just a mechanical problem and became a logistics crisis in the middle of harvest season. Versatile's 2000 had its own paper trail. PAMI, the Prairie Agricultural Machinery Institute, tested it and documented the result plainly. Crop did not feed smoothly into the rotors until the manufacturer made modifications. That report was published after machines were already sold in working fields. In barley, rotor loss ran high even at low feed rates. The core promise of any twin rotor design, holding grain, wasn't being delivered in the crop it was supposed to handle best. A few 8800s eventually crossed 3,000 hours, but only in the hands of operators who had already mapped every weak point themselves and built a personal maintenance schedule around them. For everyone else, it was exactly what the forums called it. New Idea had a different kind of trouble. The 717 wasn't a standalone machine, it was a threshing module inside their uni system, a platform where the corn head, self-propelled base, and harvesting block mounted and separated independently. For the early 1970s, that concept was genuinely ahead of its time. What wasn't ahead of its time was the bearing life. Owners burned through them at a rate one described simply as like ice cream and cake. Not a single bad run, not a flawed batch, a repeating pattern, same nodes, same failure sequence, season after season. 2 full years of warranty calls, first to the dealer, then directly to New Idea, before the company acknowledged the problem and pulled the machine in for real corrective work. 2 seasons of a documented recurring defect before the manufacturer officially moved. When the machine went down waiting for parts, the wait wasn't short. New Idea's regional dealer network didn't carry the specific bearings the 717 required, which meant ordering during harvest, days of downtime for a repair that, mechanically, wasn't complicated. The logistics made it worse than the failure itself. The uni system was also running out of market. It was built around ear corn processing, a segment shrinking fast through the 1970s as shelled corn operations scaled up. Even a perfectly running 717 was heading toward a dead-end platform. A handful of them did cross 2,000 hours, but only in operations where the owner had rebuilt joint connections under a self-developed maintenance protocol. Nothing the factory published, nothing the factory admitted to knowing. Gleaner's N5 arrived in the same era, carrying a different kind of ambition. It was their first serious rotary combine in mass production, and conceptually it was the right direction. The problem was the belt drive reverser. Under sustained field load, the reverser belts wore at a rate that made no sense for the application. The mechanism failed mid-run in the field without any warning interval. The engine on early units showed a pattern of block problems and leaks across independent operators in separate regions, not localized, not user error. Owners who later moved to updated N-series machines said the same thing. Stay away from the first ones. Too many bugs. That phrase sounds manageable. What it meant in practice was that the N5 ran as a paid development program, and the farmers who bought it first were the ones covering the cost of the testing. The reverser fix came later. The reputation came first. Gleaner looked at the N5 and made a decision that seemed logical on paper. The N6 would use the same engine, but with the RPMs turned up, more output, better numbers on a spec sheet, a stronger position against the John Deere 6600 and 7700 in side-by-side comparisons. The engine block itself hadn't changed. The tolerances hadn't changed, only the load had. The results showed up in the bearings and the rod bolts. Under sustained field conditions, real harvest load, not test track load, those components degraded faster than the design allowed for. Bearings and rod bolts became the predictable failure points on early N6 units, and the failures weren't random. They tracked directly to the elevated RPM spec. The market found the fix before the manufacturer published one. Dealers started quietly recommending a pulley swap, back to N5 specifications, back to N5 RPMs. It worked. The machine became more reliable. But the claimed performance advantage disappeared with the fix, and Gleaner never released an official technical bulletin acknowledging any of this. The correction moved through the dealer network as unofficial repair practice, not as a documented engineering response. The N6 also carried forward the belt system architecture from the N5, heavy on drive belts throughout. In a controlled shop setting, that's a manageable maintenance task. In a field breakdown, it meant longer diagnosis time and longer repair time on every single incident. No single belt was the problem. The count was the problem. The S68 arrived as a platform shift. New architecture, cleaned up concept, the right direction. The early production units just couldn't hold together long enough to prove it. No single catastrophic failure defined the early S68. It was the accumulation. A small problem here, a minor fault there, each one fixable, each one eating an hour or half a day, week after week, season after season. One documented case ended with the owner moving directly to a class election, not because of one breakdown, but because the total weight of small ones had become unsustainable. He didn't make that switch emotionally. He made it because the math stopped working. Later, S68 production stabilized significantly. The engineering issues that defined the first wave were addressed, and the machines that came off the line a year or two in were genuinely different from the ones that built the reputation. But the reputation had already moved. Forum posts from early owners had spread through dealer networks and regional farming communities before the improved units reached the market. Dealers reported slower uptake on updated machines. Buyers remembered what they'd heard, and first impressions in this industry don't reset easily. Gleaner didn't lose those customers because the S68 was ultimately a bad machine. They lost them because the first batch was, and the market doesn't wait for version 2. Massey Ferguson didn't stumble into a bad machine by accident. They made a sequence of deliberate decisions, and each one moved the needle in the wrong direction. The 510 had a real following. It moved well in North America and Britain through the early 1970s, and in its base form, it was a workable machine. Owners who knew it described it as something for people who like to wrench, not a compliment, but not a condemnation either. The 510 demanded attention, regular attention, the kind of relationship where the operator and the machine were in constant negotiation. Some people accepted that, many didn't. Then came the 540. Positioned as a replacement for the 410, it arrived with a parts inventory that told a different story than the marketing. Critical components were sourced from the lighter 300 series, lower rated, lower cost, and built for a smaller machine. Under the load, a mid-size combine actually generates, those components didn't last. The slip clutch bearing became a signature failure point. When machines from the used market were inspected, the bearing wasn't worn, it was destroyed. Not from an unusual event. As a standard finding, the idler on the auger tube was another recurring problem, described by mechanics who worked the series regularly as common enough to check before anything else. The shaker shoe overloaded under wet conditions or elevated feed rates, and the grain sample coming into the tank reflected it. Getting a clean sample out of a 540 in difficult conditions required precise, constant sieve and fan adjustment that the machine simply didn't reward with any margin for error. The 550 removed what margin was left. The direct characterization from operators and mechanics who handled the series was consistent. A cheapened 510, not a new platform, not a redesign, a cost-reduced version of a machine that was already running at the edge of acceptable. The 520 followed the same pattern. Each successive model absorbed another round of production compromises, and each one showed up in the field before the season was out. The logic behind it was straightforward. Massey was competing in a price-sensitive segment and needed to lower production costs to stay positioned. The problem is that the cost didn't disappear. It transferred. The factory saved money on components. The operator spent it on downtime, parts, and field repairs that compounded through every harvest. There's a particular irony in how some mechanics describe these machines positively. Easy to work on, accessible components, simple disassembly, good service clearance. That's a real quality, and completely backwards as a selling point. A machine becomes easy to work on when it gets worked on constantly. The 510 and 550 weren't ergonomic achievements. They were machines that had adapted or been adapted to the reality of their own failure rate. When Massey moved to the 750 and 760, they didn't carry the engineering fixes into the new platform. They carried the reputation. The 750 and 760 were everywhere. Britain, Ireland, across the European market, tens of thousands of units working through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. When a machine reaches that kind of volume, the failure statistics stop being abstract. They accumulate in real time, in real fields, across enough operators that the patterns become impossible to dismiss. The main output shaft was the central weakness of the entire platform. The shaft developed play, measurable, progressive, destructive play, directly at the drive pulleys coming off the engine. Irish mechanics who worked the series reported it consistently. The same problem, the same location, every machine of that generation. Diagnosing it wasn't complicated. Fixing it was. Correcting the shaft wear required pulling the engine completely, not adjusting it, not accessing it through a service panel, removing it. In a field at harvest, that job doesn't get done. The machine gets pulled off the field and the harvest stops with it. Frame cracks near the transmission were the second item on every pre-purchase checklist for these machines, not as a precaution, but as a near certainty. Mechanics told buyers to look there first, not because it was possible, but because it was likely. Under sustained load, the frame fatigued at that junction in a way the design hadn't absorbed. The straw walkers added a third variable. The cranks bent under elevated throughput, and on machines fitted with a cascade separator, the power takeoff load accelerated that process. A single crank bearing failure gave no warning. The walker stopped. Grain started going out the back unthreshed, and the operator often didn't catch it until the loss was already significant. Grain tank rot completed the picture on machines that had been stored with residue inside through winter. Not a manufacturing defect, but a common enough outcome that it showed up repeatedly in condition reports on used machines. The polarity in the owner feedback is difficult to reconcile until you look at the variable that actually explains it, the operator. A 750 in a British arable operation with covered storage, scheduled servicing, and a mechanic on staff could run 7,000 hours without a major rebuild. The same machine in a smaller operation with outdoor winter storage and reactive-only maintenance hit the output shaft, the frame, and the walker cranks in sequence, and never fully recovered between seasons. The machine had no tolerance buffer for the second scenario. It required the first one to deliver what was promised. What Massey didn't do was close the loop. The output shaft problem was known. The crank weakness was documented in field reports and mechanic feedback across multiple markets. Neither was addressed structurally within the series. The 750 and 760 were discontinued rather than corrected, and the operators still running them when support ended were left holding the known defects with no manufacturer behind them. The mechanic, who said he wouldn't wish a Massey combine on his worst enemy, wasn't describing a catastrophic machine. He was describing one that demanded everything from the person running it and gave nothing back in terms of forgiveness. John Deere had a good decade. The 6600 and 7700 were building exactly the kind of reputation that defines a brand for a generation. Reliable, field-proven, the machines serious operators bought when they didn't want surprises, which makes what happened with the 4400 more interesting, not less. The 4400 launched in 1969 and sold in significant numbers. On volume alone, it was a success, but somewhere inside the same product line that produced the 6600, Deere had made a set of engineering choices on the 4400 that its own operators couldn't ignore and didn't. The cab was the first problem, and it was daily. The GM engine in the 4400 ran hot, and that heat moved directly into the operator environment. On a day above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the cab became genuinely difficult to work in for an extended shift. Operators pulled the doors off. Some abandoned the cab entirely and ran the machine open. The workaround that circulated through forums and farm networks was to flush the radiator thoroughly and replace the thermostat, a field fix applied by the operator for a problem that originated at the design stage. The governor was the second issue, and it was more technically layered. On the gas engine version, it failed in ways that stacked a broken bolt between the governor halves, a weight element that shifted out of alignment and wore the housing around it. Both conditions documented on separate machines from the same operation, same governor, same failure pattern, different units. The linkage required regular attentive adjustment to stay within specification. Let it drift, and the engine stopped without warning. No gradual symptom, no interval of reduced performance. Running, then not running. Access to service points made every maintenance task take longer than it should have. The 4400 wasn't a machine that invited routine service. It resisted it. Mechanics who worked across multiple brands noted the difference directly. Standard jobs that took a set amount of time on other machines took longer on the 4400 consistently. In harvest season, that time difference compounds across every service interval. The contrast with the 6600 wasn't subtle, and it wasn't lost on anyone in the industry. Two machines, same brand, same era, one building a reputation that lasted decades, the other collecting the specific criticism of being the worst engineered combine Deere ever built. That phrase came from people who had run both. Deere never acknowledged the gap publicly, but the 6600 and 7700 that followed addressed nearly every structural complaint about the 4400. Improved cab environment, better access geometry, a more stable governor system. The response was embedded in the next product, not stated anywhere on record. What kept the 4400 in fields long after that criticism was documented had nothing to do with its engineering. Parts were available. They stayed available. The machine was simple enough that even its worst problems were fixable without specialist equipment, and the cost of keeping one running stayed manageable. The combines that outlasted their reputations almost always did it the same way, not by being good, but by being cheap to keep alive. Some of them are still out there.